Hello and welcome. Today I will discuss in detail about the life, works and political philosophy of Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine was born in 354 AD in Tagaste, a small town in North Africa, which at present is in Algeria. His father Patricius was a wealthy pagan and his mother Monica was a devout Christian. At the age of 12, Augustine was sent to Madaros, which is in modern Algeria, for his education. It was here that Augustine indulged in pursuit of pleasure in all its forms, free from the restraints of family and friends. When Augustine returned home, his father was delighted to see his son carefree in his morals. However, it was his mother Monica who tried very hard to inculcate good morals and a chaste behavior in the young Augustine. At the age of 17, Augustine was sent to Carthage, where opportunity of learning and immorality were even greater than that at Maduros. Augustine, in his Confessions, describes how he excelled in both and strived to outdo his peers in debauchery, ignoring his mother's advice against it. While at the University of Carthage, a simple advice that came from his mother planted a seed which eventually blossomed into faith. Augustine began to question his lifestyle and searched for something to satisfy his awakening conscience. He became interested in a religious sect called Manichaeans. For almost a decade, he remained under its influence, and it shaped his personality to a great extent. Augustine busied himself in studies and learned Latin, rhetoric, mathematics, logic, and philosophy. After completing his studies at Carthage, Augustine went to Rome, where he was appointed as a professor of rhetoric. On the insistence of his mother Monica, Augustine came in contact with Saint Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. He found solace in the hymns of Saint Ambrose and was highly influenced by his discourses on ethics and morality. Finally, it was at the age of 33 he converted to Christianity, and he ascribed it to an act of providence. It was on Easter Sunday in 387 AD. Augustine was baptized by Saint Ambrose. It was in fact a turning point in his life. Augustine changed altogether and started living a monastic life. He renounced the pleasure of this world and discovered the truth of Christianity. Saint Monica, the mother of Saint Augustine, was the happiest person to see her son being ordained as a highly respectable Christian priest. On realizing her cherished dream, she left for heavenly abode in peace and was greatly mourned by her son. In 391 AD, Saint Augustine went to Hippo, a city in North Africa, where he was later appointed a bishop. He preached every day till the end of his life. Despite his extensive reputation, Augustine had a humility and gentleness of spirit that drew men to him and evoked love and reverence. Saint Augustine argued capably and forcefully against the most significant Christian heresies of his time. He successfully prevented the Manichaeism, Donatism, and Pelagianism from masquerading as a form of Christianity in Africa. Lauture, a Christian historian, in his famous work, A History of Christianity, writes that no other Christian after Saint Paul was to have so wide, deep, and prolonged an influence upon the Christianity of Western Europe and those forms of the faith that stemmed from it, as had Augustine. He was consumed by a hunger for God that is reflected in this, his most famous quote: "You have made us, O Lord, for yourself, and our heart shall find no rest till it rests in you." He remained the Bishop of Hippo till his death. After a great service to the Christianity, he died on August 28, 430 AD, in the third month of the Vandal siege of Hippo. He was canonized and conferred sainthood by the Roman Catholic Church in 1303 AD. Saint Augustine lived in a transitory period, which was the parting of pagan ancient and starting of Christian medieval age. During this period, Christianity was emerging as a unifying force and paganism was being abandoned. With the adoption of Christianity as state religion by a Roman emperor, Theodosius I, in 381 AD, hostility between the church and the state had practically ceased. It was a critical time for the Christianity, as the new faith was in danger by the barbarians of South and West Europe. In 410 AD, Goths sacked Rome, and for the time being, the destruction of the city and the church that it represented appeared to be imminent. Superstitious non-Christian enemies of the church began to attribute the fall of Rome to the establishment of Christianity and disregard for the old pagan gods. They believed that under the protection of old gods like Neptune, Jupiter, and Iris, Romans had grown from small city-state to a great world empire. It was the adoption of Christianity that had brought ruin to Rome and Western Europe. Criticism of this kind prompted Saint Augustine to take up the defense of Christianity against the pagan libels. Influences on Saint Augustine. In addition to the Christian scriptures as main sources of inspiration, Saint Augustine seems to be deeply influenced by Plato, Cicero, Manichaeans, the Neoplatonists, and the Stoic philosophy. Augustine pointed out that the scriptures must not always be taken literally, for they were meant to convey deep spiritual truths to simple minds. He acknowledged that some scriptures are difficult to fathom, but argued that this is due to our own shortage of wisdom rather than any defects in the scriptures themselves. How can a man who is limited by both time and space understand God who is limited by neither? It has been said that Augustine baptized Plato. Platonic conception of God as the principle of absolute being underlies Augustine's Christianity. Augustine credits Plato with coming closest among the Greek philosophers to the Christian understanding of God. Augustine transformed Plato's secular conception of justice into religious one so as to make it applicable to the city of God. He also borrowed from him the idea of an ideal state of city of God. From Cicero, Augustine borrowed the idea of a commonwealth of the world in which all were united by a common bond. In interpreting Cicero's commonwealth, Augustine contended that a just commonwealth consisted of a rational multitude united by a common love for God rather than a common love of material well-being of the social order. Cicero's Rome brought together people for material reasons rather than spiritual ones. Before his conversion to Christianity, Augustine had come under the influence of Manichaeism, which as a form of Gnostic doctrine initially shaped his philosophy. The Manichaeans taught that the universe is divided into contradictory yet autonomous and co-equal principles of good and evil, emphasizing the duality between form and matter. Manichaeans saw the material world, including all political and social arrangements, as intrinsically evil. Augustine finally became dissatisfied with Manichaean teachings after about a decade. It is believed that while Saint Augustine later came to accept Christian view theologically, temperamentally he remained very much a Manichaean dualist. Saint Augustine was also influenced by the Stoic philosophy. The Stoic philosophy believed that the whole mankind is one universal brotherhood knit together by natural law and reason. The greatest human need was to live a happy and virtuous life in accordance with reason. Reason is universal and does not change with time and place. There can be only one universal way of life for the whole mankind based on universal reason. This Stoic idea of a universal way of life influenced Augustine in developing his idea of the city of God. Augustine was greatly influenced by Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism extended the Platonic dualism between the intelligible world of form and the sensory world of appearance. Plotinus asserted that as there are two worlds, the intelligible and the sense world, it is better for the soul to live in the intelligible world. The ultimate reality was uniting the soul with the intelligible world as being one, and it serves as a path to divinization. Augustine frankly admits in his Confessions that it was his encounter with the books of Neoplatonists that made it possible for him to view both the church and its scriptural tradition as having an intellectually satisfying and resourceful content. Thus, it was all the aggregate accumulated influence which slowly helped give philosophical shape to his Christian faith and sooner or later evolve his unique political philosophy. It is also due to apparent influences of Hellenic, Stoic and Neoplatonic ideas that some scholars have interpreted Saint Augustine's philosophy to be a form of ancient philosophy, but with a Christian gloss. For Saint Augustine, things are either black or white, good or evil. There is no in between. The historical circumstances of his life, coupled with the early religious and philosophical influences that came to bear upon him inexorably, impelled him to think in these either-or terms. It's not surprising then that his political thought manifests a profound dualism. Now let us move on to famous works of Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine was a prolific writer. He has penned down numerous books, letters and sermons. Among his famous works are Confessions and the City of God. Confessions, written around 400 AD, is considered to be the first autobiography in the Western tradition. It is a frank and humble self-analysis of his early life. In this great spiritual odyssey, Saint Augustine is intent on showing that he too is a sinner and that the indictment he throws at humanity applies equally to himself. He illustrates that depravity can only be overcome by the grace of God, and he gives his own example to explain how degraded an evil life without God can be. The most famous example in the Confessions is that of his childhood, when he stole some pears from a neighbor's tree. This, according to him, he did not because he wanted the pears, but because he loved his own perdition and his own faults, not the things for which he committed wrong, but wrong itself. The evil in him was foul, but he loved it. Apart from Confessions, his most famous work is The City of God. Saint Augustine wrote this classic, The City of God, between 413 AD and 426 AD. Augustine started to write this book in context of the scathing criticism against Christianity that it could not prevent the destruction of Rome from Goths in 410 AD. It took him almost 13 years to complete his work, in which he very effectively not only defends Christianity against pagan libels, but also in the process depicts a divine plan in the construction of a city of God. This masterpiece of Saint Augustine has been divided into 22 books, out of which first 10 books are concerned with defense of Christianity against libellous attacks of the pagans, and the remaining 12 with the construction of the city of God. Saint Augustine in his classic gives his philosophy of history. The pagan deities had not saved Rome when it was earlier sacked in 390 BC. Now, if Christianity could not avert the sack in 410 AD, it did, however, reduce and mitigate the horror and misery. The sack of Rome was a divine dispensation calculated to pave the way for the establishment of the city of God. There is a divine will behind everything. The story of mankind depends not upon chance, but upon the eternal purpose of the Creator. The history of mankind is one of struggle between the forces of evil and the forces of good. The forces of evil, as represented by the various secular empires, have been in the ascendant, but they have had their day. They are non-permanent. All earthly kingdoms must pass away. They are built on evil aspects of human nature, leading to conflict and destruction. They must give place to the kingdom of God, which will endure. If earthly states were liable to destruction, there was a city that endured, and that eternal city was the city of God, whose latest and most perfect terrestrial manifestation was the Christian Church. In books 11 to 22, Saint Augustine built his city of God. Saint Augustine extolled the virtues of the city of God by comparing it with the earthly city. Saint Augustine built up his city by mixing together the conceptions of the state of Plato and Cicero and presenting them in a setting of Christian theology. Political philosophy of Saint Augustine. Since the pagan critique of Christianity was fundamentally political in nature, Saint Augustine was compelled to engage in a political analysis of the cause of Rome's decline. His intent was not to write political philosophy for its own sake, but to defend Christianity. The need to define the appropriate roles of church and state and to defend the church from its pagan detractors compelled Saint Augustine to think and write about politics. In the process, nevertheless, he evolved a distinct political philosophy. Doctrine of original sin. The basic principle of his entire philosophy is his doctrine of original sin, according to which, apart from the grace of God, no one is capable of being without sin. It is an attempt to explain the problem of evil in the world. Ever since the original sin of Adam and Eve, men seem to have used their free will not to do good things, but to be wicked. By describing his own tortuous course, he analyzed all mankind. He was himself an illustration of man's corruption, redemption, and continuing struggle for perfection. He struggled mightily to bring logic and reason to the apparent contradictions between man's free will, original sin, and predestination. Yet, he never lost sight of the fact that faith, not reason, is the heart of Christianity. Augustine expended much effort in putting down three significant Christian heresies of the time, which were Donatism, Manichaeanism, and Pelagianism, that were promising salvation. According to Augustine, it is only through God's grace that human beings can find salvation. Apparently, if salvation is the ultimate end that Christians strive for, and if this salvation is primarily dependent on God's grace, then the political context loses its relevance as being superfluous. But as a matter of fact, human beings are weak and sinful. They will need to be controlled by coercive political institutions. If they were good, then conceivably government might not be necessary at all. Thus, the state as a coercive institution was created to maintain a minimum of order in a sinful world. Augustine believes that all human beings are born innately lustful or self-regarding. While some are saved by grace of God, they organize their lives around the principles of love rather than that of lust. Love, which is manifested first of all as love of God and then as love of one's fellow human beings, is the opposite of lust, because love is by definition other regarding. After clarifying his views on original sin, love and lust, St. Augustine puts forward his doctrine of two stees. According to St. Augustine, all human groups are mixed and are composed of both the ones that indulge in love of God as well as love of self. Thus, Augustine formulates his views on the steed of God on the premise of love of God and the earthly steed on self-love. The two steeds of St. Augustine represent the saved and the damned. The former was for the promotion of good and the later pursued evil, one aimed at justice and the other at power. The steed of God is universal in time and space. By steed of God, St. Augustine not only meant heaven, to which the Christians look forward as their eternal home, but also as its earthly counterpart, the body of true believers. The Church is in a way the concrete embodiment of steed of God, as it is in Church alone that virtue and goodness prevailed. The state is an instrument of Church for the promotion of good, and therefore the two were interdependent. St. Augustine's conception of a true steed of God was a Christianized church state from which non-believers were excluded and in which the supreme power vested with the leaders of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It was not a kingdom in the heavens, but a divine kingdom on earth based on Christian virtues and with only the saved as its citizens. Men can become members of the steed of God by grace, and since all men do not deserve grace, hence all men are not members of steed of God. Indeed, if all people were members of the steed of God, the state would not be necessary. Finally, St. Augustine puts forward his views on state. St. Augustine found the origin of the state in the gregarious instinct of man as a result of his sin. According to him, state is a divine remedy to preserve peace. The saint requires peace to worship God, the sinner to enjoy worldly pleasure. The desire for peace, therefore, is a relative good, for it is the basis of a civilized life and the existence of the state. The state has a divine sanction and therefore must be obeyed only as long as its laws do not violate religion and morality. Thus, the duty of obedience to state is not absolute. It is conditioned by the more important duty of obedience to the Church representing God. St. Augustine draws a distinction between the jurisdiction as represented by the state and the Church. The relationship between the two should be one of mutual assistance and cooperation, because the two are necessary for each other. A Christian king needs the spiritual guidance of the Church, and the Church cannot function without the law and the order which the state provides. It was an ideal which was to a great extent realized in the Holy Roman state of his day. This theocratic view of St. Augustine became accepted Christian doctrine throughout most of the medieval period. Thus, he left an everlasting contribution to Christian political thought. Saint Augustine gathered up the strands from Christian traditions and classical antiquity and wove them into a new fabric destined to influence profoundly the thought of the Church in evolving its own distinct political philosophy. It was Saint Augustine who began this process by integrating the Platonic, Stoic, and Neoplatonic ideas with the Christian doctrine. Although he was too close to the otherworldly attitudes of early Christians, yet he attempted to define the appropriate roles of church and state. All the typical medieval ideas and institutions owe their origin to Saint Augustine. The theory of two swords of Gelasius I was based on the dualism of Saint Augustine. The principle of parallelism in the Middle Ages is based on his distinction between coordinate spiritual and secular authorities, each free in its own sphere. The principle of universalism, which is the keynote of all medieval thought, is based on the Augustine's concept of a single Christian commonwealth, a universal brotherhood which transcends considerations of race and color, and in which there was the universal authority of the Pope and of the Emperor. The medieval concept of papal supremacy was based on Augustine's view that the see of God was superior to the secular state. So there is a profound influence of Saint Augustine all over the Middle Ages, when the Christianity was evolving its own unique political philosophy. Finally, to sum up Saint Augustine's pioneering contribution to Christian political philosophy in particular and medieval political philosophy in general, I would conclude this lecture by a very popular observation by Professor George Sabine, who very aptly points out that Saint Augustine's philosophy was only in a slight degree systematic, but his mind had encompassed almost all the learning of ancient times, and through him to a very large extent it was transmitted to the Middle Ages. His writings were mines of ideas in which the later writers, both Catholic and Protestants, have dug. As I said earlier, in view of his contribution to the Christian theology, Saint Augustine was canonized by Roman Catholic Church in 1303 AD, and he is highly revered and respected. That's all for now. Thank you very much.